They gave the name away, not the brand, not the factories. They gave the ownership. A dynasty that had ruled European steel for 2 centuries surrendered direct control in a single, deliberate act. Why would a family trade empire for an endowment? What does turning a pile of factories into a foundation actually buy you? And at what cost? Listen close. This is the story of how legacy, liability, and survival intersected at the end of a Krupp life. We'll trace the rise of a family that became shorthand for heavy industry. We'll follow the stain of war, and then the calculated, almost surgical removal of ownership, the move that would be remembered as a succession sacrifice. Breathe. The first minute is sharp. After that, we slow down. We walk through factories and courtrooms, boardrooms and quiet legal cabins where charters were signed. We listen to the hum of furnaces and the low, deliberate voice of strategy. The Krupp name began like so many industrial legends, small, stubborn, relentless. In 1811, a workshop in Essen became the seed of something that would outlive empires. For 200 years, the Krupps built steel, rails, cannons, and bridges. The family's wealth and influence swelled with each new mill, each new contract, each technological leap. They were Europe's industrial aristocracy, not merely rich, but essential to the continent's infrastructure and military might. That accumulation wasn't accidental. The Krupp story is a story of vertical integration long before the word had currency. Mines, forges, rolling mills, shipping. They owned pipes and the water upriver. Their wealth compounded because they owned the means, the markets, and often the politics that connected the two. Generations learned management as if it were a craft, apprenticeships, secret formulas, patriarchal succession. The pattern was simple, brutal, efficient. Then the 20th century shifted the ground beneath them. War transformed heavy industry into a strategic asset. Contracts for armaments made fortunes, and fortunes made the family both powerful and visible in ways that law or market couldn't fully control. During the Second World War, the company's factories and output became deeply entangled with the machinery of the conflict. This is where the public ledger and the private ledger begin to diverge. Factories produced more than steel. They produced consequences. Reports and testimonies after the war documented forced laborers working in Krupp plants. The association with the Nazi regime tightened like a noose around the family name. Whatever reputational capital the Krupps had built was now being accounted for, not in balance sheets, but in moral and legal inquiries. The post-war world demanded reckoning. A legal reckoning did arrive. Alfried Krupp, who had inherited leadership, was swept into it. Convicted at the Nuremberg trials for the company's wartime activities, imprisoned, and then released. His personal story became inseparable from the company's public liability. The family court of history had pronounced judgment in headlines, testimony, and official records. What happened next is the pivot, the succession sacrifice. In 1967, the year Alfried died, his entire holding was transferred into a foundation. Not slowly, not piecemeal, a single transfer that erased direct family control. The owning entity became a foundation. The Alfried Krupp, von Bohlen und Halbach Foundation. Ownership and personal legacy were split away. On paper, foundations are structures designed to hold assets in perpetuity for a purpose: research, education, social welfare. On the ground, they do something more subtle and far-reaching. They convert private capital into a perpetual corporate steward. They create a barrier between family and firm. In this case, the foundation did more than hold shares. It redefined the family's role from owner to benefactor and created legal and symbolic distance from wartime associations. There's a forensic question here. How does transferring ownership to a foundation actually function as a strategy for reputational containment and corporate survival? The mechanics are both legal and financial. First, there is permanence. A foundation is designed to last. Its charter can bind assets to specific uses and governance structures that outlive any single heir. For a charged brand, Permanence matters. It signals continuity of operation without continuity of control. The company can continue supplying steel, signing contracts, and negotiating international deals without the press repeatedly pointing to a single family member as the decision-maker. Second, there are tax and regulatory effects. Foundations, depending on jurisdictional rules, can enjoy favorable tax treatment on income from their holdings when those earnings are used for charitable purposes. That turns corporate profits into funds for public goods. The optics are powerful. Profits that once might have read as private wealth now finance scholarships, museums, hospitals. That conversion helps rewrite narrative from profiteer to benefactor. Third, governance changes. The family cedes direct votes. Boards gain authority. Trustees become the custodians of both capital and public image. In practical terms, that can align management incentives with long-term stewardship rather than short-term family dividends. It also reshapes who gets to answer the hardest questions in a crisis. Boards and trustees, not a dynastic surname. But this is not merely altruism disguised as finance. The family sacrifices direct ownership precisely because the trade-off can protect the brand. By institutionalizing control, the enterprise becomes less vulnerable to personal scandals, legal claims, and succession fights. Imagine a company in the crosshairs of historical indictment. A foundation can insulate current operations from the personal liabilities of heirs, shifting legal and reputational responsibility toward a corporate entity whose charter emphasizes continuity and public good. Yet sacrifice is never pure. What does the family lose? Control, flexibility. The intimate power to steer strategy as fortunes and markets change. For heirs raised on ownership, the psychological cost is a form of disinheritance that's also legal, the end of a dynasty as a decision-making unit. Financially, the family may retain influence, seats on boards or trustee roles, but the legal claim to sell assets, to pivot, to privatize, is gone. The dynasty survives as a name, not as a private holding. What makes the Krupp case so instructive is the context. After World War II, a company that had generated immense public wealth became a political liability. Transferring ownership into a foundation was not just a tax structuring move. It was a strategic attempt to reframe the narrative and stabilize the business. The move allowed the infrastructure of steelmaking to continue under a different moral architecture. The factories kept working. The workers kept receiving paychecks. The brand remained, cleansed, or at least governed by a different story. The economics are granular too. In turning an ownership stake into a perpetual endowment, dividends become the lifeblood of philanthropic work. Cash flows that once fueled family lifestyles now underwrite scholarships, cultural foundations, and medical centers. That repackaging reshapes stakeholder incentives. The company answers to beneficiaries of the foundation, not merely to family heirs looking for next quarter dividends. There are strategic nuances. Foundations can be set up with narrow mandates that limit how capital is used, or broad ones that allow more operational freedom. They can appoint independent trustees to distance family influence, or keep family members on boards to preserve legacy input. The Krupp transfer was, at its heart, a choice about how much distance to create. In that choice lay a moral calculus. If the family remained at the helm, would the company continue to be shadowed by prior crimes? If they stepped back, could the firm earn a new kind of legitimacy? As the decades rolled on, the consequences became visible. The Krupp Foundation funded hospitals, educational institutions, and research. The name reappeared in philanthropic events rather than trial transcripts. The company, its factories, employees, and markets continued to function and evolve. In the 1990s, the industrial landscape shifted, and a merger would merge the Krupp legacy with another German titan, producing a new corporate name. Brand continuity had a price, and the price included the family's direct ownership. Let's pause for a moment. If you're enjoying this deep dive into how money, morality, and strategy collide, consider subscribing for more. Small gesture, big stories. Beyond the individual case, succession sacrifice is a pattern worth watching. Forensic economics looks at the tracks left by such transfers, the timing, the legal instruments, the shift in cash flow, and the public messaging. The patterns reveal motives. Transferring to a foundation after a public scandal is a signal. We want to keep the enterprise, but not the liability. Transferring before a crisis can look preemptive. Transferring at death, as with Alfried, is a definitive severing. There are resisting forces in every such move. Critics argue that foundations can be used to shield assets from restitution efforts, to make it harder for victims to seek compensation. That is a real tension. When a foundation holds the shares, creditors or claimants may face a more complex legal terrain. Law and moral expectation often race to catch up. In democratic societies, courts and legislators adapt. Reparations, disclosure, and litigation can and do follow corporate restructuring. But there's a countervailing force for continuity. States value stable industry. In post-war Germany, rebuilding industrial capacity was a national priority. Political decisions sometimes favored restoring productive capacity, even when it meant tolerating uncomfortable pasts. The interplay between national interest and historical accountability makes cases like Krupp freighted with contradiction. The same hands that rebuild economies are the ones whose wartime actions demand reckoning. For the family, the sacrifice is also an emotional wound. Dynastic identity is not only money, it's a narrative about stewardship, craftsmanship, and generational knowledge. Handing the keys to a chartered foundation is, in some sense, the end of that narrative. Future Krupps might keep the name, keep a seat at a ceremony, but the private dominion is gone. That loss can be framed as penitential. It can also be framed as pragmatic. In Alfried's era, pragmatic often won. There's an irony in the endurance of the name. Brands can outlast their founders' moral choices. A name carried by a foundation can become cleaner than the people who created it. That cleansing works for markets. It works for customers. It even works for employees who need steady work. But does it work for history? Not entirely. The archival record, lawsuits, and historical scholarship continue to complicate any neat redemptive narrative. Consider the structural consequences for modern governance. When a firm's controlling interest rests in a foundation, decisions about reinvestment, dividends, and executive appointments are filtered through trustees, focused on the foundation's purpose. This can produce long-term thinking, lower appetite for risky leverage, and a bias toward stability. For industries that need patient capital, infrastructure, pharmaceuticals, basic materials, that can be beneficial. For fast-moving sectors requiring agile capital allocation, it can be a handicap. The Krupp choice made sense for steel, a capital-intensive, long-horizon industry. That's not coincidence. We can also read this as a playbook. Other dynasties have followed similar arcs. The playbook goes like this: amass assets, face public scrutiny, convert private holdings into a perpetual public-minded entity, use the charitable frame to stabilize operations and rehabilitate reputation, sacrifice direct ownership to preserve the brand and the enterprise. It's not a clean formula. It's messy and sometimes self-serving, but it is replicable, and it changes the relationship between wealth and public life. And yet, no structure fully erases accountability. Where legal culpability is at stake, courts will pursue remedies. Foundations are not impenetrable. They can be reformed, compelled to disclose, or compelled to make restitution. The endurance of a brand does not automatically rewrite history. It does, however, reshape the daily economics of production and the visible actors who represent an enterprise. As the story moves into its final act, consider the personal dimension. For descendants of dynasties, sacrifice can be both humiliation and liberation. Losing private control can be a relinquishment that frees heirs from the burden of a toxic name. Freed from ownership, they might pursue other interests or live with less public scrutiny. or they might intensify their private influence within the foundation, shaping philanthropy rather than running factories. The Krupp Foundation's long-term investments in cultural and medical institutions altered how the public encountered the name. Libraries have plaques. Clinics bear a stamp of patronage. Those are deliberate moves in the reputational economy. They don't erase history, but they redirect how a name functions in civic life. In the end, what does a succession sacrifice buy? It buys distance, time, and continuity. It aligns corporate mechanics with a narrative of reparation or stewardship. It diminishes the family's direct claim, converting a private fortune into a public institution. For some, that is redemption. For others, it is a strategic casuistry, a financial solution to a moral problem. The Krupp story leaves a lingering question. Which is worth more, the right to control or the right to have your name live on without the yoke of your darkest decisions? The family answered with a structure that outlived them. The empire's steel continued to be poured, its shareholders reconstituted as trustees, and its name was carried forward into new corporate forms. There is no tidy moral in this. There is, however, a pattern of choices that forensic economics can unpack. The timing of the transfer, the structure of the foundation, the distribution of governance rights, and the conversion of profit into philanthropic capital. Each of those choices writes a different ending for family dynasties. If this kind of close reading of money, power, and history interests you, stay tuned for more. We'll unpack other cases where inheritance and reputation collide, and the financial instruments families use to survive or disappear. For now, imagine the Krupp factories at dusk. Long lines of steel cooled, smokestacks quieted into silhouettes. The name remains on a plaque, on a foundation's letterhead, on buildings that serve the public. The people who carried the brand are gone or reduced to memory. The decision taken in 1967 did not erase the past. It reallocated responsibility, recast capital flows, and ensured that the industrial engine kept running under a new steward. That is the core of the succession sacrifice. A deliberate handoff of ownership so that a troubled name might continue to exist and operate, freed from the immediate burden of a family's shadow. It is a move that protects industry, reshapes legacy, and forces us to ask hard questions about how societies reconcile production with accountability. On some nights, the furnaces still hum in subsidiaries that trace their share ownership to that single transfer. On others, classrooms and clinics built with foundation money quietly carry forward the name as if to say, we will outlast the scandal, we will reinvent purpose, and we will keep the factories alive because people depend on them. The truth is complicated. The choices were strategic and human. The Krupp transfer was, above all, a decision to trade direct control for continuity, to make the family's last act one of institutionalization rather than inheritance. Thank you for listening. If you liked this episode, consider subscribing quietly. It helps us bring more careful stories like this into the world. Until next time, keep listening and keep asking who controls the names behind our industries.